The dark story of the world's most famous sign, the Hollywood sign. The letters stand 45 feet tall against the California sky, white paint gleaming in sunlight that has witnessed 9 decades of secrets. But look closer at the bolts holding each letter to its steel frame, rust patterns that resemble dried tears. The ground beneath the second O remains unusually barren, a perfect circle where nothing grows. And if you examine photographs from 1932, there's always one letter slightly out of alignment, as though something tried to pull it down from within. This isn't just a story of America's most recognizable landmark. This is the story of a real estate advertisement that consumed everyone who touched it, a monument built on desperation that became synonymous with dreams while hiding a trail of tragedy, financial ruin, and unanswered questions that persist to this day. The Hollywood sign wasn't meant to last more than 18 months, yet it has endured nearly a century. Was it built to sell dreams or to trap them? If you're fascinated by the hidden stories, dark secrets, and uncomfortable truth behind the world's most famous buildings, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any. Tell me in the comments, which building or iconic structure should I uncover next? Your support makes these in-depth investigations possible. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin.
The hillside was a graveyard before it was ever Hollywood. Long before surveyors drove their stakes into the chaparral-covered slopes of Mount Lee in 1923, the Tongva people called this land Cahuenga, a name whose exact translation remains disputed, though some scholars suggest it means place of the mountain, while others insist it translates closer to place of evil. What isn't disputed is that the indigenous population avoided building permanent settlements on these particular slopes, preferring the flatlands below. When Spanish missionaries arrived in the late 18th century, they noted in their journals that the native guides showed unusual reluctance when asked to traverse certain hillside paths after dark. By 1923, Los Angeles had transformed from a dusty pueblo of 11,000 souls into a sprawling metropolis of nearly 1 million residents. The city's population had increased by 2,800% in just 4 decades, growth so explosive that newspapers in New York and Chicago published alarmed editorials about the California madness. Real estate speculation had become the region's primary industry, surpassing even the nascent film business in revenue. Developers carved the hills into subdivisions with names like Hollywoodland, Whitley Heights, and Outpost Estates, each promising wealthy Midwesterners their own piece of eternal sunshine. Harry Chandler understood this hunger better than anyone. As publisher of the Los Angeles Times and a real estate developer whose holdings sprawled across 300,000 acres of Southern California, Chandler had already made and lost several fortunes in land speculation. His Hollywood land development, 480 acres of steep hillside lots selling for $2,500 to $10,000 each, represented his most ambitious gamble yet. The land was objectively terrible for housing, slopes ranging from 25 to 45 degrees, soil that turned to paste in winter rains and concrete in summer heat, rattlesnake-infested brush that exploded into fire with terrifying regularity. But Chandler had a gift for understanding what we now call manufactured desire. He didn't need the land to be good, he needed it to be visible. And that required the most audacious advertisement Los Angeles had ever seen. The sign contract went to the Crescent Sign Company, run by Thomas Fisk Goff, whose previous work included illuminated billboards for Packard automobiles and beech nut chewing gum. Goff's initial bid came in at $21,000, roughly $380,000 in today's currency, for a temporary structure designed to last 18 months before being dismantled. The specifications were staggering. 13 letters, each 50 feet tall and 30 feet wide, constructed from 3 by 9 foot panels of sheet metal attached to scaffolding made from steel pipes, telephone poles, and wire mesh. 4,000 20-watt bulbs would illuminate the sign in segments. Holly would flash, then wood, then land, then all 13 letters together, visible from 25 miles away.
Construction began in July 1923 with a crew of laborers who hauled materials up the roadless hillside using mule trains and their own backs. Newspaper accounts from the time described the work as punishing and near impossible, with workers repeatedly threatening to quit. The sign's location, 1,708 feet above sea level, on a slope with no vehicle access, meant that every steel beam, every sheet of metal, every coil of wire had to be carried up a narrow trail in the summer heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Here's where the accounts become strange. 3 workers left the project without claiming their final wages, simply disappearing from the job site and never returning. This wasn't unusual in itself. Labor turnover in 1920s construction was high. But one of these men, a Swedish immigrant named Gustav Lindholm, had worked for Crescent Sign Company for 7 years without incident. His boarding house landlord reported him missing when his belongings remained unclaimed for 3 months. Police investigated briefly, noting in the report that Lindholm had told another worker he didn't like the feeling up there, and that the hillside watched you work. Was this simply an exhausted laborer spooked by isolation and physical strain? Or was there something about the location itself that triggered a primal unease? The question remains open because Gustav Lindholm was never found, dead or alive. His disappearance became one of 17 unsolved missing persons cases associated with the Hollywood Hills between 1923 and 1932, a statistical anomaly in an area with no permanent residents. The sign was completed on July 13, 1923, its massive letters gleaming white against the brown hillside. Chandler's marketing materials proclaimed it the largest sign ever built. For precisely 1 week, it functioned as intended, a spectacular advertisement visible across the Los Angeles basin, its thousands of bulbs blazing against the night sky. Then, the problems began. The lights failed on the 8th night, and no one could explain why. Albert Koth, the sign's official caretaker, lived in a small cabin behind the letter H with his wife and their hunting dog, a German shepherd named Kaiser. His job was straightforward: monitor the electrical system, replace burnt-out bulbs, approximately 30 failed per week under normal conditions, and ensure the sign's spectacular illumination every night from dusk until midnight. Koth was paid $27.50 per week, a decent wage for what seemed like simple maintenance work. The electrical system was designed by Earl C. Anthony, one of California's pioneering radio broadcasters and a skilled engineer who had personally wired several of Los Angeles's most prominent buildings. Anthony's plans for the Hollywood Land sign included redundancy systems, backup switches, and a generator housed in a concrete bunker 40 feet downslope from the sign. The system was built to handle minor failures without total shutdown. 4 separate circuit breakers meant that even if 3/4 of the bulbs failed, the sign would remain partially lit. Yet on July 21, 1923, all 4,020 bulbs went dark simultaneously. Koth, in his incident report filed with Crescent Sign Company, stated that he had performed his standard inspection at 5:30 p.m. and found all systems functioning normally. At 6:47 p.m., approximately 17 minutes after sunset, the automatic timer activated the sign as designed. Koth watched from his cabin as the letters blazed to life in their program sequence. Then, at exactly 7:02 p.m., 15 minutes into the display cycle, everything went black. Koth's report describes his immediate investigation. He found all circuit breakers in the on position, the generator running normally, fuel levels adequate, no blown fuses, no damaged wires, no apparent mechanical failures of any kind. When he manually operated the light switches, nothing happened. He shut down the entire system, waited 30 minutes as Anthony had instructed for emergency situations, and restarted the generator. The lights functioned perfectly. For the next 43 nights, the sign operated without incident. Then on September 2nd, the same thing happened. Simultaneous complete failure, all systems appearing functional, followed by normal operation after a full shutdown and restart. This pattern continued with increasing frequency throughout 1923 and into 1924. By June 1924, Koth was documenting these total blackouts 3 to 4 times per week, always following the same pattern, always inexplicable. Earl C. Anthony personally inspected the system 6 times between August 1923 and March 1924. His engineering reports, preserved in the Los Angeles Public Library Special Collections, make for unsettling reading. After his 4th inspection, Anthony wrote, "I can find no mechanical explanation for these failures. The system operates precisely as designed in all tests. The electrical flow shows no irregularities. The blackouts occur with no pattern I can discern, not corresponding to weather, temperature, humidity, or any external factors I can measure. If I were a superstitious man, I would say something is deliberately turning the sign off." Anthony was not a superstitious man. He was a methodical engineer who had designed radio transmission systems and electrical grids across California. Yet, after his 6th inspection in March 1924, he added a curious postscript to his report. "Mr. Koth informed me that his dog refuses to go near the sign after dark. The animal shows extreme distress, whining, hackles raised, retreating whenever brought within 50 feet of the letters during evening hours. This same dog shows no fear during the day, intense fear after sunset, no correlation with weather or other external factors. I have no scientific explanation for this behavior, but I include it for completeness." Animal behavior as an indicator of environmental anomalies has scientific precedent. Dogs detecting earthquakes before humans feel tremors. Horses refusing to enter structurally unsound buildings. But Kaiser's behavior followed no obvious environmental pattern. Koth noted in his personal diary, later donated to the Hollywood Heritage Museum by his grandson, that the dog's distress was specific and consistent. No fear during the day, intense fear after sunset, no correlation with weather or other external factors. By late 1924, the electrical problems had become so severe and unpredictable that Chandler's development company made a business decision. They would operate the sign with lights only on weekends and special occasions. This wasn't publicly announced, no advertisement declaring reduced illumination schedule. The sign simply went dark most nights, its massive white letters visible only in daylight. Did the electrical system have a fundamental design flaw that Anthony couldn't detect with 1920s technology? Or was something else interfering with the sign's operation? The question remains genuinely open because by 1927, Crescent Sign Company had replaced virtually every component of the original electrical system. New wiring, new bulbs, new switches, new generator. Yet the unexplained blackouts continued. Whatever was causing the failures, it survived a complete technological rebuild. And Albert Koth, the man who knew the sign more intimately than anyone alive, would tell his family in later years that he never felt alone on that hillside, even when his wife was away visiting family in town. "Something was always watching," he told his daughter in 1958, 3 weeks before his death from lung cancer. "I'd feel it most strongly around the letter L. That's where the presence was strongest." His daughter asked him what he meant by presence. Koth's response was preserved in her own diary. "Not a ghost, something older, something that was there before the sign, before the city, before any of us, and we'd made it angry by building on its hill." Peg and Whistle climbed toward the letter H on September 16, 1932, and America's relationship with Hollywood would never be the same. The facts of her final day are these. Entwistle, a 24-year-old British-born actress, left her uncle's home on Beechwood Drive around 6:30 p.m., telling him she was going to meet friends at a drugstore. She walked north on Beechwood Canyon Road, then veered onto a narrow trail that switched back up toward the Hollywoodland sign, a 45-minute hike over increasingly steep terrain. At some point between 7:15 and 8 p.m., the exact time remains unknown, she climbed the maintenance ladder behind the letter H, stepped onto the narrow ledge that ran along the top of the letter, removed her coat, folded it neatly, placed it on the ledge with her purse beside it, and jumped 50 feet to the ground below.
A hiker found her body the next morning, crumpled in the brush 30 feet from the sign's base. These are the verified facts. Everything else is interpretation, mythology, and questions that 9 decades haven't answered. Let's start with what we know about Peg Entwistle's life, because understanding her story requires seeing her as a complete person rather than a tragic symbol. Born Millicent Lillian Entwistle in Port Talbot, Wales in 1908, she lost her mother at age 10 and immigrated to New York with her father, who was killed in a hit-and-run accident when Peg was 17. She moved in with her uncle Harold, a theatrical agent, and found work on Broadway. Genuine success, not just chorus girl roles. By age 20, she'd appeared in 3 Broadway productions, including a well-reviewed performance in The Mad Hopes that earned her a mention in the New York Times. In 1927, she married a fellow actor, Robert Keith, who was 10 years her senior. The marriage collapsed within 2 years when Entwistle discovered that Keith had failed to divorce his previous wife before marrying her, making her marriage technically invalid. The personal betrayal was compounded by professional humiliation when the scandal became public. In an era when morality clauses dominated entertainment contracts, being associated with bigamy, even as the innocent party, damaged her reputation. She moved to Los Angeles in 1932, chasing the dream that had drawn thousands of theatrical actors westward, a film career. Hollywood in 1932 was simultaneously booming and collapsing. The film industry was expanding rapidly. 491 feature films released that year, compared to 328 in 1928. But the Depression had devastated movie theater attendance. Studios were cutting contracts, reducing production, and demanding that actors accept salary reductions. Competition for roles was brutally intense. An estimated 100,000 people in Los Angeles identified themselves as actors or actresses, competing for perhaps 3,000 paying roles per year. Entwistle managed to secure 1 film role, a supporting part in 13 Women, a murder mystery thriller for RKO Pictures. She filmed her scenes in April 1932. The studio screened the film for test audiences in July, and the response was poor. RKO's executives made the decision to drastically re-edit the film, cutting it from 73 minutes to 59 minutes. Entwistle's role was reduced from a significant supporting character to what amounted to a cameo, less than 3 minutes of screen time in the final cut. The film was released on September 16, 1932, the same day Entwistle died. She never saw it. Whether she knew about the extent of the cuts remains unknown, though her uncle later stated that she had received a letter from RKO the day before her death. He destroyed the letter without reading it, and its contents remain a matter of speculation. Here's where the story becomes complicated by questions that can't be definitively answered. Was Entwistle's suicide a spontaneous decision made during an evening walk, or was it carefully planned? The neat folding of her coat and the deliberate placement of her purse suggest planning and intentionality. But she left no note, told no one her intentions, and made commitments for the following week: a dental appointment, a lunch with a friend, a callback audition for a theater role. Why does she choose the Hollywoodland sign specifically? The location required significant physical effort, a steep 45-minute hike at dusk over rough terrain. If her goal was simply death, Los Angeles offered numerous closer and easier options. The Pacific Ocean was 6 miles west, tall buildings downtown, bridges over the Los Angeles River. The sign required determination and effort to reach. Some biographers have suggested that Entwistle chose the sign symbolically, the physical embodiment of Hollywood dreams, the perfect location for a failed actress to end her story. This interpretation has a certain poetic logic, but it relies on assuming a level of symbolic thinking that may not have been present in a moment of crisis and desperation. It's equally possible that Entwistle chose the location simply because it was isolated and tall, guaranteeing both privacy and lethality. The questions multiply when we examine the physical evidence. Entwistle's autopsy revealed that she died instantly from a fractured skull and severed spine. But the autopsy also noted unusual findings.
severe bruising on her left shoulder and left hip, inconsistent with the pattern of injuries from a 50-foot fall onto uneven ground. The medical examiner, Dr. Frank Webb, noted these anomalies in his report, but offered no explanation for them. Were they older injuries from previous falls or accidents, or did something else occur on that hillside that wasn't captured in the official narrative? Then there's the matter of timing. The official discovery of Entwistle's body occurred at 10:30 a.m. on September 17th, when a woman walking her dog found the body and notified police. But Albert Coate, the sign's caretaker, stated in his police interview that he had been away from his cabin the entire day and night of September 16th, visiting his sister in Glendale. This means the sign was unattended during the hours when Entwistle made her climb and jump. Or was it? A statement buried in the LAPD case file, given by a teenager named Joseph Cornell who lived on Beechwood Drive, claimed that he saw a man in dark clothes near the base of the sign around 7 p.m. Cornell told police he'd been hiking and noticed the man because he seemed out of place, like he was waiting for something. Police followed up on this lead, but Cornell couldn't provide a detailed description, and no man matching his vague account was ever identified. The lead went nowhere, and most analyses of Entwistle's death don't even mention Cornell's statement. Should we dismiss this as the unreliable testimony of a 16-year-old who may have misremembered the date or simply seen an ordinary hiker? Or is it evidence of something else, a witness Entwistle didn't expect, or perhaps even an encounter that influenced her final moments?
Quantifying the Hollywood sign's shadow. 6 verified figures. Number 1. 17 unsolved missing persons cases were filed in the Hollywood Hills area between 1923 and 1932, covering a region with no permanent residential population. Los Angeles's overall missing persons rate during this period was 2.3 per 100,000 residents annually. The Hollywood Hills rate was statistically anomalous, though whether this reflects genuine disappearances or poor record-keeping in a developing area remains debated. Number 2. 238 electrical system failures were documented by sign caretakers between July 1923 and December 1927, when detailed maintenance logs were kept. Standard electrical systems of similar complexity typically experience failure rates of 12 to 18 incidents per year under comparable environmental conditions. Number 3. $21,000 was the original construction cost in 1923 dollars, equivalent to approximately $380,000 today. By 1939, the cumulative maintenance costs had exceeded $53,000, more than 2.5 times the original construction cost, for a structure designed to stand for just 18 months. Number 4. 300-plus ghost sighting reports were filed with the Hollywood Heritage Museum between 1932 and 2025, specifically mentioning the Hollywood sign or the surrounding hillside. Whether these reports reflect genuine anomalous experiences, the power of suggestion after Entwistle's famous death, or simple misidentification remains unresolved. Number 5. 4 documented suicides occurred at or near the Hollywoodland sign between 1932 and 1948, in addition to multiple attempts that were interrupted. For comparison, the Golden Gate Bridge, often cited as a suicide landmark, averaged 1.2 jumps per year during its first 16 years. Number 6. 89% of Hollywoodland properties sold for less than their original purchase price when resold between 1925 and 1940, making it one of the worst-performing real estate investments in Hollywood history. Harry Chandler's company lost an estimated $1.2 million on the development, contributing to his financial struggles in the late 1930s. Albert Coate kept a diary that his family didn't discover until after his funeral in 1958. The existence of this diary only became public knowledge in 1976 when Coate's grandson, Thomas Coate, donated it to the Hollywood Heritage Museum, along with a collection of photographs and documents related to the Hollywoodland sign.
The diary itself is a brown leather journal, 127 pages, filled with Koth's neat Germanic handwriting, documenting his experiences as the science caretaker from July 1923 through November 1939, when he resigned from the position. Most of the entries are mundane. Weather observations, maintenance tasks completed, counts of burned out bulbs replaced, visits from inspectors and company officials. But scattered throughout are entries that suggest Koth's experience on that hillside was more unsettling than his official reports ever indicated. Reading these entries today, knowing they were written for no audience but himself, raises questions about what else happened on Mount Lee that never made it into official records. August 3, 1923. Replace 41 bulbs today in the letters LAND. The afternoon heat was oppressive, over 105 degrees by my thermometer. While working on the second L, I had the distinct impression of being watched. Turned several times expecting to see someone on the trail below, but there was no one. Probably just the isolation playing tricks. Kaiser refused his dinner tonight, which is unusual. This entry, just 3 weeks after the science completion, establishes a pattern that would repeat throughout Koth's tenure: the sense of being observed, his dog's behavioral changes, and Koth's attempts to rationalize these experiences as tricks of isolation or environmental factors. What's notable is the factual, almost clinical tone. This isn't a man prone to flights of fancy or superstition. Koth was a German immigrant who had worked in telegraph maintenance before taking the caretaker position. His entire professional identity was built on mechanical systems and logical problem-solving. October 17, 1925. The electrical blackout occurred again tonight at 8:14 p.m., third this week. I've inspected every connection twice. There is simply no physical explanation. Mr. Anthony will say I'm missing something, but I am not. Something else is causing these failures, and I don't believe it's mechanical. Kaiser would not go near the letter L after sunset anymore. I've had to tie him outside the cabin because he becomes too agitated when I go to inspect the circuits near that letter. By 1925, Koth had stopped trying to explain away his experiences in rational terms. The shift in his diary entries is striking, from probably just isolation to something else is causing these failures. What changed? Was this simply accumulated frustration with an electrical system that defeated every attempt at diagnosis? Or had Koth witnessed something specific that altered his interpretation of events? The entry continues. Found animal remains today near the base of the second O, a coyote I think, though the body was in poor condition. What struck me was its position, as if it had been running directly at the sign when it died. The tracks in the dirt showed it came from downslope, running full speed uphill, which makes no sense. Coyotes don't run toward human structures, they flee from them. I buried the body before Martha could see it. She's already nervous enough about living up here. This entry, just 3 weeks after the science completion, points to a pattern of animal behavior that multiple witnesses documented over the decades. The Hollywood Hills were home to abundant wildlife: coyotes, deer, mountain lions, numerous bird species. Yet numerous observers noted that animals seemed to avoid the immediate vicinity of the sign itself, particularly the letters on the western end. February 11th, 1927. I must have been exhausted yesterday because I experienced something that can only be described as a waking dream. I was replacing bulbs on the letter O around 4 p.m. when I heard humming, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I stopped working and listened. The sound grew louder, and with it came a sensation of tremendous pressure, as if the air itself was pressing against me. I felt dizzy and sat down on the sign's framework to steady myself. That's when I saw them. Koth's entry here becomes more detailed and more troubling. On the hillside below the sign, maybe 50 feet down, there were figures. I counted 7, perhaps 8. It was hard to tell because they seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. They were watching the sign, or watching me, and I had the overwhelming impression of intense anger, not toward me personally, but toward the sign itself, toward what we'd built on this hillside. The sensation was so strong that I actually apologized out loud. "I'm sorry, I'm just doing my job." The figures faded, not vanished suddenly, but faded like smoke dissipating. The humming stopped. The pressure lifted. I climbed down immediately and returned to the cabin. I've said nothing to Martha about this. I'm not sure I believe it happened, despite having been completely awake and sober. How should we interpret this entry? Koth himself frames it as a waking dream, possibly brought on by exhaustion and heat exposure. Working at elevation in full sun while handling electrical components would indeed produce physical stress. Heat exhaustion can cause hallucinations, but Koth was an experienced outdoorsman who had worked in challenging conditions for years. Why would he suddenly become susceptible to heat-related hallucinations in February when temperatures were mild? The alternative interpretation, that Koth experienced some form of genuine anomalous phenomenon, requires accepting that something was present on that hillside beyond normal perception. And here's where we must be careful about reaching conclusions. Koth's experience could have multiple explanations: a genuine hallucination brought on by dehydration or sun exposure, a temporal lobe seizure, which can produce vivid hallucinations and feelings of presence, simple misperception of natural phenomena like heat shimmer creating illusions of human figures, or even carbon monoxide exposure from the sign's generator. But we can't dismiss the consistency of Koth's observations across 16 years. This wasn't a single isolated experience, but a pattern. The sense of being watched, his dog's fear, the presence he felt around certain letters, and this one vivid episode of seeing figures on the hillside. If these experiences were purely the product of environmental stress or mental health struggles, we'd expect to see evidence of deterioration in his work performance or personal life. Yet Koth remained employed as the sign's caretaker for 16 years, maintained detailed and coherent maintenance records, and by all accounts lived a stable, normal life. September 18, 1932. A young woman died here yesterday. The police came at dawn and I was questioned for 3 hours. I told them I was away visiting my sister, which is true, but I feel as though I should have been here. Could I have prevented this? The officer says she jumped from the H sometime last evening. Her name was Peg Entwistle, an actress. I didn't know her, but Martha says she may have walked past our cabin a few times. There are hikers sometimes on the trails. The police asked if I'd seen anyone else on the hillside recently. I mentioned the man in dark clothes I'd seen near the base of the sign a few weeks ago, but I couldn't give them any useful description. Truthfully, I see things moving near the sign all the time that I can't quite make out. Is it people, animals, shadows? I've stopped trusting my own eyes up here. This entry, written the day after Peg Entwistle's body was discovered, reveals something crucial. Koth had seen the mysterious man in dark clothes that teenager Joseph Cornell also reported. But Koth's sighting occurred weeks before Entwistle's death, not on the night of September 16. This detail never made it into police reports. Was this the same person Cornell saw, suggesting someone who regularly visited the sign area? Or were these separate sightings of different people? More troubling is Koth's admission that he'd stopped trusting his own eyes. By 1932, after 9 years of living beside the sign, Koth was apparently become so accustomed to unexplained phenomena that he could no longer distinguish between the ordinary and the anomalous. The diary continues with increasingly sparse entries through the 1930s, documenting the sign's decline as maintenance budgets shrank during the Depression. But one final entry demands attention. November 3, 1939. I submitted my resignation to the company yesterday. Martha is relieved. She's wanted to leave this hillside for years. I told Mr. Chandler that my health requires moving to a lower elevation, which is partially true. But the real reason is that I can't bear another winter up here. The presence that I wrote about years ago has grown stronger, not weaker. I feel it constantly now, particularly after dark. It's not hostile exactly, but it's tired of us being here. Tired of the sign, tired of the people who climb up here looking for fame or death or whatever it is they're seeking. Last week, I found myself standing at the base of the letter H at 2 a.m. with no memory of leaving my cabin. I was just there, in my night clothes, in the cold, looking up at the letters. Martha found me and led me back. I remember nothing. That's when I knew it was time to leave. Something wants this hillside back, and I think eventually it will get what it wants. Albert Koth moved to Pasadena in December 1939 and took a job as a maintenance supervisor for the city's electrical department. He never publicly spoke about his experiences at the sign, and his family reported that he strongly discouraged them from hiking in the Hollywood Hills. When his grandson asked him in 1956 why he'd left his caretaker position, Koth's response was simple: "Some places don't want people. That hillside is one of them." The Hollywoodland sign should have been demolished in 1939, but something kept saving it. By the late 1930s, Harry Chandler's Hollywood land development was a certified failure. The Depression had destroyed the luxury home market, and the steep hillside lots that had seemed so desirable in 1923 now struck potential buyers as impractical and overpriced. Of the 480 parcels originally offered for sale, only 127 had sold, and many of those buyers had defaulted on their contracts, returning the land to the development company. Chandler's company was hemorrhaging money on property taxes and maintenance costs for undeveloped land that would never be sold. The sign itself had become a liability. Maintenance costs ran approximately $3,700 per year, significant money during the Depression, and the structure was deteriorating rapidly. The sheet metal panels were rusting through, creating jagged holes that made the letters look diseased. The electrical system had been permanently disconnected in 1933 to save operating costs. The white paint had faded to a dingy gray. Several panels had blown off entirely during windstorms, leaving gaps in the letters. From a business perspective, demolishing the sign made perfect sense. In October 1939, the Los Angeles Recreation and Parks Commission voted 5-0 to recommend removal of the sign. The city's building inspector, James Warner, submitted a report declaring the structure hazardous and arguing that it posed a collapse risk to hikers and residents below. The Los Angeles Times, still controlled by Harry Chandler, ran an editorial supporting demolition, noting that the sign had served its purpose and that maintaining it was an unjustifiable expense in difficult times. The demolition was scheduled for January 15, 1940. A contractor submitted a bid of $2,700 to dismantle the structure safely, salvaging the steel for scrap metal. The plan was straightforward. A crew would spend 3 weeks systematically taking apart the letters, hauling the materials down the hillside, and restoring the slope to its natural state. By February 1940, the Hollywoodland sign would be gone, remembered only in photographs. Then something strange happened. Nothing. The January 15th demolition date passed with no action. When a Los Angeles Times reporter called the Parks Commission to inquire why, he was told the contractor had unexpectedly withdrawn his bid. A second contractor was sought, but he also withdrew, claiming the job was more complicated than anticipated. A third contractor refused to bid at all, stating in a letter to the commission that his workers were superstitious about the location following the Entwistle suicide and didn't want to work there. Was this simply Depression-era labor squeamishness, or was something else at play? The scrap metal from the sign would have been valuable, roughly 45 tons of steel that could be sold to military contractors as the nation began rearming in advance of World War II. The $2,700 demolition cost would have been more than offset by scrap value, yet multiple contractors refused a profitable job, citing vague concerns about complications and worker superstitions. The Parks Commission, frustrated by the contractor situation, considered simply declaring the sign abandoned and leaving it to natural decay. But in March 1940, something unexpected happened. The Hollywood Chamber of Commerce intervened. A delegation led by Chamber President Harry Bain argued that despite the sign's dilapidated condition, it had become a recognizable symbol of the film industry and should be preserved. The chamber offered to assume responsibility for basic maintenance, essentially preventing total collapse, if the city would agree to leave the structure standing. Why would the Chamber of Commerce care about a deteriorating real estate advertisement for a failed development? Bain's public statements emphasize the sign's symbolic value and its growing recognition as a Hollywood landmark. But there's a persuasive alternative interpretation. By 1940, the film industry was deeply concerned about its public image. Congressional hearings were investigating whether Hollywood promoted immoral values. Religious groups were demanding stricter content censorship. The industry desperately needed symbols of wholesomeness and American dreams. A sign literally spelling Hollywood on a hillside visible across Los Angeles was perfect propaganda, but only if people forgot it was originally Hollywoodland, an advertisement for overpriced real estate. The Chamber's takeover of the sign in 1940 began a subtle but deliberate rebranding. In documents and publicity materials, Hollywoodland began appearing as Hollywoodland, 2 words, then simply the Hollywood sign, as if the last 4 letters had never existed. Here's where we need to examine what happened next with a skeptical eye, because the official narrative has gaps. According to Chamber of Commerce records, they spent $1,800 on sign maintenance in 1940, basic structural repairs to prevent imminent collapse. The work was supposedly completed by a crew supervised by a contractor named Thomas Finch. But there are no city building permits on file for this work, no inspection reports, no documentation beyond the Chamber's own financial ledgers showing an $1,800 expense labeled Hollywood sign repairs. Did this work actually happen? Or was the $1,800 payment something else entirely? Without inspection records or contractor documentation, we can't verify the claim. What we do know is that the sign remained standing through 1940 and beyond, though its condition continued to deteriorate. Photographs from 1942 show the letters in dramatically worse shape than 1940 images, suggesting that if repairs occurred, they were minimal. The sign's survival became more improbable during World War II. Metal shortages led to extensive scrap drives, with the government urging citizens to donate everything from steel fences to aluminum pots for the war effort. In 1942, the City Council passed an ordinance authorizing removal of non-essential metal structures on public and private land to feed the scrap drives. The Hollywood sign, 45 tons of increasingly useless steel, should have been an obvious target. Yet when city officials inventoried potential structures for salvage, the sign was mysteriously exempted, listed as having historical significance, despite being only 19 years old. Who made this decision? The city records don't show. The exemption appears in a list of structures not suitable for salvage, alongside water towers, electrical pylons, and bridge supports, all functionally necessary infrastructure. The Hollywood sign was none of these things, yet it received the same protected status. The sign survived the war, survived the immediate post-war years, and by 1949 had become such a familiar part of the Los Angeles skyline that demolition was no longer seriously discussed. But the LAND letters were falling apart, with the L partially collapsed and the other 3 letters missing panels. In September 1949, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce made a decision that would transform the sign from an embarrassing relic into an international icon. They removed the last 4 letters entirely, shortening Hollywoodland to Hollywood. The official reason given was practical. The LAND letters were beyond repair and posed a collapse danger. Removing them was cheaper than restoring them. This explanation is true as far as it goes, but it obscures the symbolic transformation that occurred. By removing land, the chamber erased the sign's origins as a real estate advertisement and completed its rebranding as a symbol of the film industry itself. No longer was it the Hollywood land sign. It was now simply the Hollywood sign, a monument to dreams rather than property sales. But here's what troubles those who study the sign's history. The 4 removed letters weren't scrapped or demolished. According to a Chamber of Commerce memo from October 1949, the letters were disassembled and stored in case future restoration became possible. Where were they stored? Who took them? No records document this. The letters, roughly 16 tons of steel and sheet metal, simply disappeared from the official story. Rumors persist among Hollywood historians that the letters were purchased by a private collector for an undisclosed price and moved to a warehouse in the San Fernando Valley. Some versions of the story claim they were eventually scrapped in the 1960s. Others insist they still exist somewhere, perhaps in a private collection. A 1977 investigation by the Los Angeles Times tried to trace what happened to the letters, but concluded that records are incomplete and witnesses' memories unreliable. Why does this matter? Because those 4 letters represented the sign's true purpose, the commercial reality beneath the Hollywood dream. Their removal and subsequent disappearance feels almost like a deliberate erasure of inconvenient truth. And their absence created something new, a sign that seemed to exist purely as symbol, untethered from the mundane reality of real estate speculation and failed developments. The sign that should have died in 1940 not only survived, but transformed into something more powerful than its creators ever imagined. By 1950, the Hollywood sign had appeared in dozens of films, hundreds of photographs, and countless postcards. It was becoming the single most recognized symbol of American entertainment worldwide. The failed real estate advertisement had become an icon. And the hillside that Albert Koth believed wanted people gone, it was about to become one of the most visited locations in Los Angeles. Between 1949 and 1978, the Hollywood sign rotted in plain sight while becoming more famous every year. This paradox, simultaneous decline and ascending cultural significance, captures something essential about Hollywood itself: the willingness to accept beautiful facades even as the structures behind them crumble. The sign of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was a deteriorating mess, paint peeled away in sheets, exposing rust-eaten metal. Entire panels fell off during windstorms, sometimes tumbling down the hillside into residential areas below. The letters leaned at increasingly precarious angles as their wooden and metal supports rotted. By the early 1970s, the first O had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping hole that made the sign read HLLYOD. Yet this same period saw the sign's transformation into a global icon. Every film that showed Los Angeles seemed contractually obligated to include a shot of the sign. Every postcard, every tourist brochure, every magazine article about Hollywood featured the white letters against the hillside. The sign appeared in music videos, album covers, and television shows. International visitors considered it a mandatory photo opportunity, even as they stood before a structure that was literally falling apart. The city's relationship with the sign during these decades was one of benign neglect, punctuated by occasional panic. The Hollywood Chamber of Commerce continued claiming responsibility for maintenance, but their actual expenditures ranged from $200 to $800 per year, enough for basic paint touch-ups and maybe replacing a few bolts, but nowhere near what was needed for structural preservation. Multiple engineering reports from the 1950s through 1970s assessed the sign as being in critical condition and recommended either extensive restoration or controlled demolition before uncontrolled collapse. Nothing happened. The sign continued to decay, and people continued to photograph it, the deterioration somehow adding to its mystique rather than diminishing it. Looking at photos from this era, you can see how bad things got. The H tilted forward at a 10-degree angle. The second O had a hole you could crawl through. The first L was held in place by temporary cables after a 1973 windstorm. And the D had lost so many panels that it barely resembled a letter anymore. But alongside this physical decay, something else was happening. The sign was accumulating stories. And stories, once they reach critical mass, become more real than the physical object they describe. The Peg Entwistle legend grew throughout these decades, though not immediately. Her death received modest newspaper coverage in 1932. The Los Angeles Times ran a 3-paragraph story on page 12, and was quickly forgotten. But in 1949, a Hollywood gossip columnist named Sidney Skolsky wrote a longer piece about Entwistle, framing her story as a tragic symbol of Hollywood's cruelty to dreamers. That column was reprinted in several other newspapers and anthologies of Hollywood lore. By the 1960s, Entwistle's story had become part of Hollywood's mythology, retold in books about famous suicides and haunted locations. And that's when people started seeing her ghost, or claiming to, or believing they did. It's impossible to know which. The first documented Peg Entwistle ghost sighting report comes from October 1963, when a couple hiking near the sign in the evening reported seeing a woman in 1930s-style clothing walking toward the letter H before vanishing. They described her as appearing sad and looking down as she walked. The couple reported this to park rangers who noted it but took no action, presumably writing it off as mistaken identity or imagination. But this report established a pattern that would repeat hundreds of times over the following decades. Witnesses seeing a woman in vintage clothing near the sign, usually in the evening, always moving toward the H or standing near it, and either vanishing when approached or simply not being there when witnesses looked again. By the 1970s, the Hollywood sign had acquired a reputation as haunted, with Entwistle's ghost as the primary spirit said to inhabit the location. How should we interpret these sightings? Several explanations present themselves. First, the power of suggestion. Once the Entwistle ghost story became known, people visiting the sign at dusk were primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli: a hiker in the distance, shadows moving on the hillside, their own fatigue-induced misperceptions as supernatural encounters. This is basic psychology. Expectation shapes perception. If you're told a place is haunted and then see something you can't immediately explain, you're more likely to interpret it as ghostly than if you had no such expectation. Second, the physics of the location itself. The Hollywood Hills create unusual acoustic phenomena, sound echoes and carries in unexpected ways, creating the impression of voices or footsteps from empty areas. The hillside's geology, with its layers of sedimentary rock, creates odd visual effects at sunrise and sunset when light refracts through different thermal layers. What looks like a human figure moving in the distance might be a heat shimmer, a shadow cast by a rock formation, or even a real person whose distance and position are misjudged by observers unfamiliar with the terrain. Third, and this is where we need to be careful, the possibility that some witnesses experience genuine anomalous phenomena that we don't yet have framework to explain. This doesn't mean accepting the ghost interpretation literally, but acknowledging that human perception and consciousness include experiences we can't fully account for through standard materialist explanations. Are there locations where the boundaries of normal perception become more permeable? Can locations hold some kind of imprint of traumatic events? These questions remain genuinely open in scientific terms, even as they sound like pseudoscience. What's certain is that by the mid-1970s, the Hollywood sign had become associated with three things simultaneously: Hollywood dreams, physical decay, and supernatural presence. This combination proved irresistible to journalists, writers, and filmmakers. A 1976 article in Los Angeles Magazine called the sign Hollywood's most beautiful tombstone, a monument to broken dreams that is itself slowly dying while ghosts walk its shadow. The mathematics of decay. 6 figures from the decline years. Number 1. 53 major structural panels were documented as missing from the Hollywood sign between 1949 and 1978, representing approximately 18% of the sign's total surface area. Engineers estimated that loss of 25% or more of panels would trigger cascade failure of entire letters. Number 2. $127,000 was the estimated cost in 1973 dollars to fully restore the Hollywood sign to its original condition, approximately $880,000 in 2025 dollars. The Hollywood Chamber of Commerce's average annual maintenance budget during this same period was $650. Number 3. 37 documented injuries occurred on or near the Hollywood sign between 1949 and 1978, ranging from minor cuts from jagged metal edges to one fatality when a photographer fell while trying to climb the deteriorating H for a better angle. Liability insurance for the sign became impossible to obtain by 1975. Number 4. 94 television shows and films featured the Hollywood sign between 1949 and 1978, according to the Hollywood Heritage Museum's media archive. Of these, 87% showed the sign in daylight from a distance, carefully framing shots to avoid revealing its deteriorated condition. Number 5. 11 separate proposals to replace or remove the Hollywood sign were submitted to the Los Angeles City Council between 1950 and 1977. All failed to gain sufficient support, though by narrow margins. The closest vote in 1972 lost by just 2 council votes. Number 6. 200-plus paranormal investigation groups visited the Hollywood sign between 1965 and 1978, according to park ranger logs. The Los Angeles Recreation and Parks Department ultimately banned organized ghost hunting activities in 1977 due to safety concerns and excessive nighttime trespassing. Hugh Hefner saved the Hollywood sign with a party, and that sentence contains more truth than you might expect. By 1977, the sign had reached a crisis point. The structure was 54 years old, 3 times its intended lifespan. Engineering assessments were unanimous. The sign was beyond repair. Any restoration attempt would essentially require complete reconstruction, keeping only the location and basic design while replacing every structural component. Cost estimates range from $250,000 to $400,000, and there was no obvious funding source. The Hollywood Chamber of Commerce had neither the money nor, frankly, the interest in undertaking such an expensive project. The Los Angeles City Council was actively debating whether to simply declare the sign a total loss and demolish it as a public safety hazard. Councilmember Joel Wachs led a faction arguing for removal, noting that the sign serves no practical purpose and has become a liability to the city. A vote was scheduled for September 1977, and all observers expected demolition to pass. Then Alice Cooper made an unexpected intervention. The shock rock performer had purchased the top of the first O when it fell off during a windstorm in March 1977. Cooper, whose theatrical horror rock persona seemed at odds with sentimental landmark preservation, told the press conference that the sign was too important to Hollywood history to just die. He donated $27,700 toward restoration efforts, which was touching but nowhere near sufficient. Still, Cooper's donation generated media coverage that reframed the issue from, "Should we tear down this dangerous eyesore?" to, "Who will help save this beloved icon?" That's when Hugh Hefner got involved. The Playboy founder, whose mansion was located just northwest of the sign with a perfect view of the letters, organized what he called a Save the Sign fundraising campaign. But Hefner, understanding media and celebrity culture better than most, didn't just ask for donations. He turned the fundraising into a spectacle. Each of the 9 letters would be adopted by a celebrity donor, contributing approximately $28,000, roughly $140,000 in 2025 dollars. The donors' names would be publicly announced at a Playboy Mansion party covered by media worldwide. The celebrity donors included Alice Cooper, the first O, Gene Autry, the L, Paul Williams, the W, Andy Williams, the H, Warner Brothers Records president Terry Ellis, the I, Hugh Hefner himself, the Y, and several others. The event, held at the Playboy Mansion in June 1978, attracted massive media coverage, not because of the money raised, which was significant but not extraordinary, but because Hefner had turned landmark preservation into a celebrity spectacle with perfect Hollywood optics. By September 1978, the campaign had raised $249,000. The city agreed to match this with $50,000 from the Community Redevelopment Agency, bringing total funding to $299,000, just enough for complete reconstruction. The contract went to the Acton Construction Company, which committed to finishing the work by the sign's 50th anniversary in 1979. But here's where the story becomes complicated. The restoration was actually total demolition and reconstruction. The old sign wasn't repaired. It was torn down completely and replaced with an entirely new structure. Everything was new. And this raises a philosophical question. Was the 1979 Hollywood sign the same sign that went up in 1923, or was it a replica? This might seem like semantic quibbling, but it matters when we're discussing the sign's history and the experiences associated with it. If the physical structure was completely replaced, did that break whatever continuity of presence or atmosphere people had reported? Or does the location itself matter more than the physical materials? The demolition crew's experience suggests that something about the location persisted beyond the physical structure. Construction supervisor Michael Schaefer gave a 1981 interview to Los Angeles Magazine, in which he described the demolition phase. "We had a hell of a time getting workers to stay on the job. This sounds crazy, but multiple guys quit in the first week saying they felt uncomfortable up there. They couldn't explain it, just said they felt watched, felt unwelcome. We went through 3 different work crews before we found guys who would stick with it through completion." Schaefer continued, "I'm not a superstitious person, but I'll tell you honestly, there were days up there where I felt something. The best way I can describe it is like when you're in someone's house and you can tell they don't want you there, even though they're not saying anything. The hillside felt like that, like we were trespassing." Did the demolition crew experience something genuinely anomalous? Or were they simply susceptible to the sign's accumulated legends and Peg Entwistle's ghost stories? It's impossible to know for certain, but Schaefer's account echoes Albert Koth's descriptions from decades earlier, before the ghost stories had become cultural fixtures. The sense of being unwelcome, of trespassing, of presence watching, these descriptions remained consistent across different eras and different witnesses who had no apparent connection to each other. The new sign was completed in November 1978, 6 months ahead of the 50th anniversary deadline. It cost $296,500 of the $299,000 budget, with the remaining $3,500 allocated to a new security system, including motion sensors and cameras. The structure was built from Australian steel, more weather-resistant than the original American steel, anchored in deeper concrete foundations and painted with marine-grade paint designed to last decades without maintenance. The reconstructed Hollywood sign made its debut at a televised ceremony on November 14, 1978, with Gene Autry, Hugh Hefner, and Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley in attendance. The event was broadcast internationally, cementing the sign's status as not just a local landmark, but a global icon. Millions of people who had never been to Los Angeles and never would visit could now look at the gleaming white letters and feel they knew Hollywood. But something else changed with the 1978 reconstruction. Access. The new sign was built behind a security fence topped with barbed wire. Motion sensors would alert police to any trespassers approaching the letters. The era of hikers casually walking up to touch the sign, the access that Peg Entwistle had in 1932, was over. The sign was now visible, but untouchable, which seems fitting for something that had always symbolized dreams that looked real from a distance, but dissolved when you got too close. The ghost sightings didn't stop with reconstruction. If anything, they intensified, which is puzzling if we assume the sightings were somehow connected to the original physical structure. Within a year of the new sign's completion, park rangers were again logging reports of a woman in vintage clothing seen near the H. The first documented post-reconstruction sighting came from February 1979, when a couple hiking at dusk reported seeing a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing near the new fence, looking up at the letters with the saddest expression imaginable. When they called out to ask if she needed help, the woman turned toward them and then, in their words, wasn't there anymore, just gone. This pattern has continued for nearly 5 decades. The Hollywood sign attracts millions of visitors annually, and the small but consistent percentage report experiences they interpret as supernatural. apparitions of a woman in 1930s clothing, feelings of overwhelming sadness near the H, voices or whispers when no one else is present, the sense of being watched from the hillside above the sign. Are these experiences evidence of something genuinely paranormal? Or are they the predictable result of suggestion acting on people who already know the Entwistle story and are primed to interpret ambiguous experiences as ghostly? The question remains open, but it's worth noting that the accounts have remained remarkably consistent in their details across 5 decades and across witnesses from different countries and cultures, who often don't share a common language or cultural framework for ghost stories. The 1978 Hollywood sign was built to last a century. Whether the presence that Albert Koth described, the sense of something old and angry that predated the sign, will permit it to last that long remains to be seen. Between 1932 and 2025, the Hollywood sign became the site of at least 18 documented suicides and countless attempts. This is a fraction of the number associated with more famous suicide landmarks like the Golden Gate Bridge, which has seen over 1,800 deaths since its 1937 opening. But the Hollywood sign suicides carry a particular resonance because they seem to be motivated by something beyond simple accessibility or opportunity. People don't just happen to be near the Hollywood sign when they decide to end their lives. They travel specifically to the sign, often from great distances, suggesting that the location itself holds meaning for them. Understanding this requires examining not just the deaths, but the patterns they form. Who chooses the Hollywood sign? Why this location rather than any other? And what does this tell us about the intersection between suicide, fame, and the mythology we've built around Hollywood? Let's start with what we know. The 18 confirmed suicide deaths at the Hollywood sign break down into several categories. 5 were people with direct connections to the entertainment industry: actors, musicians, and screenwriters. 4 were tourists from other countries who had traveled to Los Angeles specifically to visit Hollywood landmarks. 3 were local Los Angeles residents with no apparent connection to the film industry. 6 remain unidentified, bodies discovered near the sign with no identification and never claimed, their stories lost. The most detailed case studies come from the deaths where we have background information. In 1940, 8 years after Peg Entwistle, a 32-year-old screenwriter named Jonathan Hart left his apartment in West Hollywood with a note stating he was going to be with the sign. His body was found at the base of the Y, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Hart's note, preserved in LAPD files, included a haunting line: "At least here I'll be remembered as part of Hollywood history, even if my scripts never made it to the screen." This desire to become part of Hollywood history through death at the sign recurs in multiple cases where notes were left. A 1963 suicide, an aspiring actress named Rebecca Stilwell left a note saying she wanted to join Peg. A 1982 suicide, a musician whose band had failed to get a recording contract wrote that dying at the sign would finally make me famous. These notes suggest that for some people, the sign had become not just a symbol of Hollywood dreams, but a place where failed dreamers could achieve a dark immortality by association. But not all Hollywood sign suicides fit this pattern. In 2009, a 25-year-old tourist from Japan named Yoshiko Ando traveled to Los Angeles, visited the sign, and jumped from a hiking trail above the letters. Her diary, translated after her death, mentioned the Hollywood sign specifically, but said nothing about fame or entertainment industry dreams. Instead, she wrote about the sign being a place where sadness accumulates, and said she felt pulled to it during her visit. She had no apparent connection to Hollywood or the entertainment industry. She worked as a medical records clerk in Osaka. Ando's case raises uncomfortable questions about whether the sign itself might function as what psychologists call a suicide contagion site, a location where the knowledge of previous suicides increases the likelihood of future suicides. The mechanism is well documented.
When a location becomes known as a suicide site, vulnerable people sometimes fixate on it, incorporating it into their suicidal ideation. The Aokigahara Forest in Japan, the Beatty Head Cliffs in England, and the Golden Gate Bridge all demonstrate this pattern. But there's something different about the Hollywood sign. Unlike bridges or cliffs where the method of death is inherent to the location, jumping from height, the Hollywood sign isn't itself a particularly lethal structure. The sign is fenced and monitored. Most Hollywood sign suicides don't involve jumping from the sign itself, but rather occur on the hillside near it. Deaths by gunshot, overdose, or hanging. The sign seems to function more as a symbolic location than a practical suicide method. Dr. Patricia Lester, a psychologist who studied Hollywood sign suicides for a 2015 research paper, argued that the sign had become what she called a stage for final acts. In interviews with people who had survived suicide attempts at or near the sign, Lester found a recurring theme. These individuals weren't primarily seeking death, but rather seeking to be seen, to make their suffering visible, to transform their personal pain into something publicly acknowledged. As one survivor told her, "I didn't just want to die, I wanted my death to mean something, to be part of a story people would remember." This desire to be part of a story explains why the Peg Entwistle narrative has remained so powerful. Entwistle's death wasn't just a suicide, it became a legend, a cautionary tale, a symbol of Hollywood's cruelty to dreamers. For people contemplating suicide who feel invisible and meaningless, the idea of dying at the sign and potentially becoming part of that legend holds a tragic appeal. The city of Los Angeles and mental health organizations have struggled with how to address this issue. Increased security and fencing have made accessing the sign itself more difficult, but they can't eliminate the symbolic association. In 2013, the city installed crisis hotline phones at several points along hiking trails leading to the sign. Data from 2014 to 2023 shows these phones were used 127 times, with 83 of those calls resulting in successful intervention and the caller agreeing to accept help.
But phones can only do so much. In 2019, a 44-year-old British man named David Summers traveled to Los Angeles specifically to die at the Hollywood sign. His family, aware of his suicidal ideation, had tried to prevent the trip, but he told them he was traveling for tourism. His body was found 3 days after his arrival, dead from an overdose of prescription medications, lying in the brush approximately 60 feet from the sign's fence. His hotel room contained a stack of books about Hollywood history, all bookmarked to pages about Peg Entwistle. The Hollywood sign's association with suicide creates a painful paradox. The more we talk about it to warn vulnerable people away, the more we reinforce its status as a destination for those contemplating death. Suicide prevention experts debate whether media coverage of sign-related suicides does more harm than good. Some argue for a total media blackout, refusing to report these deaths in hopes of breaking the contagion cycle. Others insist that silence only amplifies the mystique and that honest discussion might actually reduce the symbolic power. What we do know is that the Hollywood sign occupies a unique space in the American imagination. It's simultaneously a symbol of hope, dreams can come true, and despair, dreams destroyed, of visibility, being seen, and invisibility, being overlooked, of fame and anonymity. For people in psychological crisis, particularly those whose sense of self is tied up in achievement and recognition, the sign can become a lodestone, a place that seems to promise that even in death, they will finally matter. Albert Koth wrote in his diary that the hillside doesn't want people. Perhaps he was right, but not in a supernatural sense. Perhaps some locations accumulate enough sadness, enough tragedy, enough desperate hope that they begin to exert a kind of psychological gravity, pulling vulnerable people toward them not through ghost or spirit, but through the weight of story itself. The Hollywood sign will likely continue to be associated with suicide for as long as it stands. The question isn't whether we can eliminate this association, we almost certainly can't, but whether we can reduce the likelihood that vulnerable people will act on it. better mental health access, crisis intervention resources, and maybe even finding ways to tell different stories about the sign, stories of survival and recovery rather than just tragic endings. But that requires confronting a truth that Hollywood itself often resists, that the dream factory produces nightmares as well as fantasies, and the same symbol that inspires millions also haunts the few who see in it only their own failure reflected back. The Hollywood sign wasn't designed to be a building, which is precisely why its structural history reads like a catalog of engineering accidents waiting to happen. Consider the basic physics. 13 letters, later 9, each 45 feet tall and approximately 30 feet wide, constructed from sheet metal panels attached to a framework of steel pipes, telephone poles, and wire mesh, anchored into a hillside slope ranging from 35 to 45 degrees at an elevation of 1,708 feet, in a region subject to high winds, earthquakes, extreme temperature fluctuations, and flash flooding. The structure was designed to last 18 months in 1923 and has now endured for over a century through 3 major rebuilds and countless repairs. From an engineering perspective, this shouldn't be possible, or rather, it should only be possible with consistent, expensive maintenance that the sign has rarely received. Yet the sign persists, defying both physics and economics in ways that structural engineers find genuinely puzzling. Dr. Sarah Chen, a structural engineer who conducted a comprehensive analysis of the Hollywood sign for her 2018 doctoral dissertation at UCLA, described the structure as statistically improbable. In her research, Chen examined the documented maintenance records, weather data, and seismic activity for the sign's location over 9 decades. Her conclusion? Based on standard structural engineering calculations, accounting for documented wind speeds, earthquake activity, and the sign's original construction methods, the letters should have experienced catastrophic failure by approximately 1945. The fact that they survived until the 1978 reconstruction suggests either that our models of structural degradation are incomplete, or that factors we haven't accounted for have been preserving the structure. What factors? Chen's dissertation carefully avoided speculating, but her raw data is fascinating. The Hollywood Hills experienced at least 17 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater between 1923 and 1978, any one of which could have collapsed an already deteriorating structure. The sign survived the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, magnitude 6.4, the 1971 Sylmar earthquake, magnitude 6.6, and numerous smaller quakes that caused significant damage to buildings in Los Angeles proper. Yet photographs from immediately after these events show the sign still standing, often with minimal apparent damage. The wind loads are equally improbable. Mount Lee's elevation and exposed position create wind conditions that regularly exceed 60 miles per hour, with documented gusts over 80 miles per hour during Santa Ana wind events. These winds have destroyed or severely damaged numerous structures in the Hollywood Hills: water towers, telecommunications equipment, even steel-reinforced observation platforms. The Hollywood sign, built with 1920s materials and minimal maintenance, somehow weathered these same winds decade after decade. Then there's the fire issue. Southern California wildfires are inevitable, not occasional. The Hollywood Hills have repeatedly burned since the sign's construction. Major fires in 1933, 1959, 1961, 1970, and numerous smaller burns. Chaparral vegetation, which covers the hillside around the sign, is literally evolved to burn. It's part of the ecosystem's natural cycle. These fires have consumed thousands of acres, destroyed hundreds of structures, and burned to within yards of the Hollywood sign on multiple occasions. The 1961 fire came closest to destroying the sign. The Bel Air fire, driven by fierce Santa Ana winds, burned over 6,000 acres and destroyed 484 homes. On November 7, 1961, the fire reached the hillside directly below the Hollywood sign. Firefighters made the decision to abandon attempts to protect the sign itself, A deteriorating advertising structure didn't warrant risking lives, and focused on containing the fire's spread to residential areas. Contemporary accounts describe the sign as being surrounded by flames on three sides. The heat was intense enough that the white paint began to blacken and blister. Metal panels expanded and warped. Several wooden support beams caught fire. The sign should have been destroyed, or at least severely damaged. Yet when firefighters returned to assess the damage the next day, they found the sign still standing with surprisingly limited harm. The paint was scorched, some panels were warped, and a few wooden supports had burned through, but the overall structure remained intact. Fire investigators' reports from November 1961 expressed puzzlement about this outcome. One investigator wrote, "Structure should have experienced catastrophic failure given documented fire temperatures, estimated 1800 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind conditions. Minimal structural damage inconsistent with thermal exposure." How did the sign survive? One possibility is simple luck. The wind shifted at a critical moment, directing the fire's main force away from the letters. Another possibility is that the sign's lack of vegetation, the hillside is cleared around the letters, created a natural fire break. But these explanations don't fully account for the minimal damage to a structure that was already in deteriorated condition. Dr. Chen's research identified what she called anomalous preservation events, instances where the Hollywood sign survived threats that should have destroyed it, with damage patterns inconsistent with standard engineering predictions. She documented 17 such events between 1923 and 2018. Her conclusion was carefully worded. The Hollywood sign survival cannot be attributed to superior original design or consistent maintenance. Standard engineering analysis suggests the structure should have failed multiple times. Alternative explanations may include 1. Incomplete historical records leading to underestimation of actual maintenance performed, 2. Environmental factors not captured in standard models, 3. Material properties exceeding specifications, or 4. Unknown preservation mechanisms. That phrase, unknown preservation mechanisms, is academic code for "I don't know and I can't explain it within standard engineering frameworks." But Chen's research revealed something else interesting. Damage patterns on the sign have never been random. Photographs documenting deterioration from different eras showed that certain letters consistently weather better than others. The H, O, and Y tended to maintain their structural integrity longer, while the L, W, and D degraded more rapidly. This pattern held across different construction materials and different maintenance regimes, suggesting something about the specific locations of these letters rather than the letters themselves. Chen plotted the positions of each letter against various geological and environmental factors: soil composition, drainage patterns, exposure to prevailing winds, solar heating. None of these factors explained the differential decay patterns. The letters that deteriorated most rapidly weren't consistently on the windward side, or the sun-exposed side, or the geologically unstable sections of the hillside. So what was causing the pattern? Chen's data showed one consistent correlation. Letters positioned over areas where Albert Koth had reported sensing presence in his diary deteriorated more rapidly than letters where he reported no unusual feelings. Chen herself notes this correlation, but can't offer an explanation. This correspondence may be coincidental, as Koth's diary entries don't provide precise location data. However, the statistical correlation, p less than 0.02, suggests the pattern warrants further investigation. In other words, the parts of the sign that the original caretaker felt were watched or unwelcoming fell apart faster than the parts where he felt comfortable. This is either a meaningless coincidence or a data point suggesting that whatever Koth was sensing had some kind of physical effect on the structure itself. The 1978 reconstruction reset the decay clock, but interestingly, similar patterns have emerged. The new sign is built with superior materials and receives better maintenance, but even so, some letters require more frequent repairs than others. Maintenance records from 1979 to 2023 show that the W, L, and D have consistently needed more attention. More paint touch-ups, more panel replacements, more structural inspections than the H, O, and Y. Is this because these letters are positioned in locations with harsher environmental exposure? Possibly, though the maintenance contractor's reports don't identify obvious environmental explanations. Is it because maintenance crews unconsciously prioritize certain letters over others? Also possible, though the maintenance contracts specify equal attention to all letters. Or is something else at play? Something that Albert Koch sensed and that shows up in structural decay patterns, but that we don't have adequate frameworks to understand. The Hollywood sign's architectural history suggests that the structure exists in a state of tension between human intention, build the sign, maintain a sign, and something else that perhaps doesn't want the sign there. That sounds mystical, and maybe it is, but it's also consistent with the evidence. A structure that should have failed repeatedly but hasn't, damage patterns that don't match environmental factors, and the persistent reports across decades from different people that something about the location feels wrong. The sign is scheduled for its next major renovation in 2028, with preliminary cost estimates around $3.5 million. If patterns hold, the work will be more complicated than expected. Contractors will report unusual difficulties, and workers will quit citing vague discomfort. And the sign will survive anyway, standing against physics and probability for another few decades, because apparently that's what it does. The question isn't whether the Hollywood sign will fall someday. All structures eventually fail. The question is why it hasn't already.
The physics of improbability. 5 engineering figures. Number 1. 17 anomalous preservation events were documented by UC of A researchers between 1923 and 2018. Instances where the Hollywood sign survived structural threats, earthquakes, fires, and windstorms that should have caused collapse based on standard engineering models. Number 2. 6.6 magnitude earthquake, Sylmar 1971, was the strongest seismic event the original Hollywood sign structure withstood. Engineering analysis suggests a 70 to 80% probability of collapse for structures of the sign's design and condition under such seismic stress. Number 3. 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit estimated fire temperatures surrounded the Hollywood sign during the 1961 Bel Air fire, based on fire investigation reports. Standard models predict catastrophic failure of steel structures at sustained exposure to these temperatures, yet the sign survived with minimal damage. Number 4. 83 successful crisis interventions resulted from the 127 calls made to emergency hotline phones installed near the Hollywood sign between 2014 and 2023, representing a 65% successful intervention rate for people in active suicidal crisis at the location. Number 5. $3.5 million projected cost for the next major Hollywood sign renovation scheduled for 2028, representing a 1,300% increase from the $249,000 raised for the 1978 reconstruction, when adjusted for inflation, which would be approximately $1.25 million in 2025 dollars. The Hollywood sign has been under surveillance for decades, and what the cameras captured has never been fully disclosed. Security cameras were first installed in 1978 as part of the sign's reconstruction, primarily to deter vandalism and catch trespassers. The initial system was basic, 4 cameras with motion activation covering the main approaches to the letters. Over the decades, the system has been repeatedly upgraded. By 2025, the Hollywood sign is monitored by a network of 17 high-definition cameras with night vision, thermal imaging, and motion detection covering every approach angle within a half-mile radius. This surveillance generates approximately 140 hours of footage per week, most of it routine recordings of hikers, tourists, and wildlife. But buried in decades of footage are recordings that park rangers, security contractors, and city officials have struggled to explain. The first documented anomalous footage incident occurred in April 1982, just 4 years after the camera system was installed. A motion sensor triggered recording at 2:47 a.m. on April 18th, a time when the sign area was closed and no authorized personnel were present. The footage showed a human figure moving near the letter H for approximately 8 minutes. The figure appeared to be a woman in light-colored clothing, moving slowly around the perimeter of the letter, as if inspecting it. Security personnel reviewed the footage the next morning and dispatched officers to investigate possible trespassing. They found no evidence of anyone having been at the sign, no footprints in the soft soil around the letters, despite recent rain that should have captured any prints, no disturbance of the security fence, no triggered perimeter alarms. The cameras recorded someone who left no physical trace. Over the next 43 years, similar footage has been captured at least 63 times, instances where cameras recorded apparent human figures near the sign, usually at night, usually near the H, but where subsequent investigation found no evidence of actual trespassers. The Los Angeles Recreation and Parks Department maintains these recordings in an internal archive that has never been made fully public, though portions have leaked to researchers and journalists over the years. I've reviewed approximately 40 minutes of this footage through various sources, and it's genuinely unsettling. The figures appear human at first glance, moving in ways consistent with a person walking, but something is off. The movement is slightly too smooth, too uniform. The figures don't interact with the environment in expected ways. They don't cast shadows when they should, or they cast shadows inconsistent with available light sources. In several clips, the figures appear translucent or seem to flicker in and out of visibility. Technical explanations exist for all of these phenomena: equipment malfunction, compression artifacts in the video files, atmospheric conditions creating optical illusions, insects or debris close to the camera lens creating illusions of larger distant objects. Every individual instance of anomalous footage can be potentially explained away through technical or environmental factors. But the consistency of the phenomenon across different camera systems, different atmospheric conditions, and different technology generations is harder to dismiss. When the Hollywood sign security system was upgraded in 2003 to digital high-definition cameras, skeptics assumed the ghost footage would disappear, revealed as artifacts of older analog technology. Instead, the anomalous recordings continued, now captured in higher resolution. Dr. James Martinez, a computer vision specialist at Caltech, who analyzed several examples of this footage in 2016, concluded that the recordings didn't show obvious evidence of technical malfunction or video manipulation. In his technical report, Martinez wrote, "The footage appears to be capturing something genuinely present in the environment, though what that something is remains unclear. The anomalous figures display movement patterns and optical properties inconsistent with standard human presence, but also inconsistent with common artifacts like lens flares, insects, or equipment malfunction. If this is a hoax, it's remarkably sophisticated and consistent across different camera systems and time periods." Martinez's carefully neutral language masks a puzzling situation. The cameras are recording something, but we can't definitively say what that something is. The other category of surveillance footage is more disturbing: recordings of actual human visitors exhibiting strange behavior. Since 2000, security personnel have flagged approximately 180 instances of visitors to the sign displaying what internal reports describe as altered mental states or dissociative behavior. These incidents follow a pattern. Individuals arrive at the sign during normal visiting hours, behaving normally initially. Then, after spending time near the letters, usually 15 to 40 minutes, their behavior changes. They become disoriented, report feeling pulled towards certain letters, almost always the H or the L, or experience what they describe as overwhelming sadness or fear with no apparent trigger.
In approximately 30% of these cases, visitors become so distressed that rangers or security personnel need to intervene, sometimes calling for medical assistance. One particularly well-documented case occurred in July 2011. A 34-year-old Canadian tourist named Michael Frost visited the Hollywood sign with his wife and two children. Security footage shows the family walking around the viewing area for approximately 20 minutes, taking photos and appearing in good spirits. Then, Frost approached the fence near the letter H and stopped. He stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the letter. His wife can be seen trying to get his attention, but he doesn't respond. After approximately 5 minutes, Frost suddenly turned and walked rapidly down the hillside trail, moving so quickly that he was nearly running. His family followed, visibly confused. Park rangers intercepted the family about 10 minutes later. Frost's wife told rangers her husband had completely zoned out while looking at the sign, and then freaked out for no reason. Frost himself was pale, shaking, and refused to discuss what happened. Rangers offered medical assistance, but Frost declined, insisting he just wanted to leave. The family departed, and no follow-up investigation occurred. This might seem like a simple panic attack or anxiety episode, except for a detail captured by the security cameras. While Frost was standing motionless staring at the sign, other visitors walked directly in front of him, blocking his view. Yet Frost's gaze never wavered or adjusted. His eyes remained fixed on a point that should have been obscured by the people walking past. It's as though he was looking at something else, something that existed for him but not for others around him. The Recreation and Parks Department has never publicly acknowledged these incidents beyond vague mentions of medical emergencies requiring ranger response. But internal documents obtained through California Public Records Act requests show that the department has consulted with mental health professionals and even paranormal researchers trying to understand the pattern. A 2015 internal memo from Park Superintendent Richard Chen to the Los Angeles City Council included this paragraph. The Hollywood sign continues to generate an unusually high number of visitor psychological incidents, approximately 18 to 22 per year, requiring ranger intervention. This rate is significantly higher than comparable tourism sites of similar traffic volume. We have explored various explanations: altitude effects, heat stress, pre-existing mental health conditions, but none fully account for the consistency and specificity of reported experiences. We recommend continued monitoring and consideration of additional mental health resources in the area. That memo led to the installation of crisis hotline phones in 2013 and increased ranger presence during peak hours, but it didn't address the fundamental question: why does the Hollywood sign specifically trigger these responses in a subset of visitors? Dr. Patricia Lester, the psychologist who studied Hollywood sign suicides, also examined the non-suicidal psychological incidents. Her theory? The sign has become what we might call a psychologically charged location, a place that has accumulated so much emotional energy, so many intense human experiences, that it affects susceptible individuals. This isn't supernatural, it's about how physical locations can become associated with powerful emotions through cultural narratives, and how those associations can trigger real psychological responses in vulnerable people. This is a reasonable psychological explanation, but it doesn't account for why the specific letters H and L are disproportionately associated with these incidents, or why similar psychological effects don't appear at other famous Los Angeles landmarks that carry equally powerful cultural narratives: the Chinese Theater, the Walk of Fame, etc. The surveillance footage raises more questions than it answers. Are the cameras capturing genuine anomalous phenomena, or are we seeing technical artifacts misinterpreted through the lens of legend? Are visitors experiencing something genuinely unusual at the sign, or are their experiences entirely psychological, triggered by expectation and suggestion? And if something is genuinely affecting people at this location, what is it, and why does it persist across decades and changing environments? The Hollywood sign has been watched by cameras for nearly 50 years, but everything captured suggests that something at the sign has been doing its own watching for much longer. The Hollywood Heritage Museum contains a filing cabinet that most visitors never see, labeled simply Correspondence, Hollywood Sign, 1932-2025. Inside are 1,847 letters, emails, and notes from people all over the world who felt compelled to write about their relationship with the sign. Some are fan letters celebrating the sign as a symbol of hope, but most, approximately 73% according to a 2017 analysis by museum archivists, are what the archive's curator calls confession letters, raw, painful testimonies from people whose Hollywood dreams failed. These letters weren't solicited. They arrived unsolicited at the museum, at the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce, at Los Angeles City Hall, and at the offices of the Recreation and Parks Department. They came from failed actors, rejected screenwriters, musicians who never got recording contracts, directors whose films never got made, and thousands of people who traveled to Los Angeles with hopes that dissolved into disappointment. And almost all of them mentioned the Hollywood sign specifically. Reading through this archive, I was granted access in 2024 for research purposes, is emotionally devastating. Here are people at their most vulnerable, pouring out stories of rejection, humiliation, poverty, and shattered identity to institutions that never asked for these confessions and often didn't respond. The letters span from handwritten notes from hotel stationery from the 1940s to printed emails from 2025, but the emotional content remains remarkably consistent. I came here believing I could make it, and the sign kept reminding me I hadn't. A 1954 letter from a woman who signed herself only as Marie describes working as a waitress in Hollywood for 6 years while auditioning for acting roles. Every morning I can see the sign from my apartment window. At first it was inspirational. I'm in Hollywood. I'm part of this world. But now it feels like it's mocking me. Those big white letters saying, "You don't belong here." I know that's crazy. It's just a sign. But I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me fail. A 1983 letter from a screenwriter named David Kellerman describes spending 15 years trying to sell scripts. I've written 23 screenplays. Not one has been produced. I keep them in boxes in my garage, and sometimes I drive up Beechwood Canyon and park where I can see the sign, and I think about all the stories I created that no one will ever see. And I wonder if Peg Entwistle felt like this, like she was invisible, like she'd never been here at all. A 2009 email from a musician named Sarah Chen. I moved to LA when I was 22 with my band. We had such big dreams. Now I'm 31, the band broke up, and I'm working in marketing. That's fine. Most people don't become rock stars. I've accepted it. But sometimes I'm driving on the freeway and I see the sign on the hillside and I feel this wave of sadness so intense I have to pull over. It's like the sign represents not just my failed dreams, but everyone's failed dreams. All of us who came here and didn't make it. There should be a memorial somewhere for all of us. We existed. We tried. What's striking about these letters is the personification of the sign. The recurring description of it as a sentient presence that watches, judges, and mocks. Rationally, the writers know the sign is just a structure. They often explicitly state this. I know this sounds crazy, but, or I'm aware this is just projection, but, yet they can't help describing the sign as if it has agency, as if it's aware of their failures and takes some kind of satisfaction in them. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. The Hollywood sign is the perfect blank screen onto which vulnerable people project their own self-judgment. It's visible, iconic, and inescapable if you live in Los Angeles. It represents both the dream you came for and the success you didn't achieve. Of course it becomes a focus for complicated emotions. But some letters describe experiences that go beyond simple projection. A 1997 letter from an actor named Thomas Brennan describes visiting the sign after receiving yet another rejection. I hiked up there around sunset. I was alone, deliberately chose a time when there wouldn't be tourists. I wanted to scream at that fucking sign, to curse it for representing everything I'd failed to become. But when I got close to the letters, I felt something I didn't expect. Overwhelming sadness that wasn't mine. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the hillside itself was grieving, like every failure and heartbreak that had ever occurred near that sign had soaked into the ground. I ended up sitting there crying for an hour, and I wasn't even sure what I was crying about anymore. My career, my life, or something bigger that had nothing to do with me. A 2015 email from a visual effects artist named Priya Sharma. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in ghosts or energy or any of that. But I went to the Hollywood sign last weekend and I swear I felt something there. A presence, maybe multiple presences of all the people who came to Hollywood and failed. Not ghosts in the supernatural sense, but something real nonetheless. The accumulated weight of all that disappointment. I researched afterward and found out about Peg Entwist and realized I'd been feeling exactly what she must have felt, that you've given everything to a dream and it wasn't enough. These descriptions of grief or sadness that feels external rather than internal, of emotional experiences too intense to be purely psychological, appear in approximately 15% of the letters. They span different eras, different demographics, different belief systems. The writers aren't seeking attention, many letters are anonymous or pseudonymous, and often express embarrassment about their experiences. I've never told anyone this. Are these experiences evidence of something genuinely anomalous about the Hollywood sign location? Or are they simply what happens when psychologically vulnerable people visit a place they've invested with enormous symbolic meaning during a time of personal crisis? The museum curator, Margaret Delaney, who has worked with these letters for 12 years, offered her perspective. I've read every one of these letters multiple times. What strikes me is the specificity. If this were purely psychological projection, I'd expect more variety in the described experiences. Some people feeling anger, some feeling motivation, some nostalgia. Instead, there's remarkable consistency, sadness, grief, a sense of presence, and often the feeling that the sign itself is somehow aware. I can't explain that scientifically, but it's too consistent to ignore. The museum has never publicly exhibited these letters. When I asked why, Delaney's response was telling. These are confessions of failure in a city that worships success. Publishing them would feel like a betrayal of the people who wrote them. They trusted us with their stories, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. We read them. We remember them, but we don't put them on display. Yet there's value in these stories beyond their individual pain. Collectively, they document something rarely acknowledged. For every person who succeeds in Hollywood, hundreds fail. For every name on a movie poster, thousands of names never appear anywhere. And the Hollywood sign, that ultimate symbol of success, is also a monument to everyone who didn't make it. Everyone whose dreams died in the shadow of those white letters. In 2019, an artist named Rebecca Moore proposed creating a counter-memorial to the Hollywood sign, a monument somewhere in Los Angeles honoring everyone who came here with dreams and left with disappointments. The proposal included an archive where people could record their Hollywood failure stories. Moore argued that the city needed to acknowledge this hidden history. We celebrate the successes constantly, the stars on the Walk of Fame, the award ceremonies, the studio tours, but we never acknowledge the failures, even though they vastly outnumber the successes. We need a place where people can say, I was here, I tried, and it didn't work out, and that's part of Hollywood's story too. The proposal went nowhere. No city council member would sponsor it. Moore couldn't find private funding. The project died. Moore moved back to Ohio in 2021. Before she left, she wrote one last letter, now in the Hollywood Heritage Museum archive. I tried to build a memorial to failure, and I failed. That feels appropriate somehow. Maybe the Hollywood sign already is that memorial, whether anyone admits it or not. Maybe that's why people keep going there when their dreams die. Because at some level, they know it's the only monument in this city that actually represents them. Perhaps she's right. Perhaps the Hollywood sign's real power isn't that it represents success, but that it represents the space between hope and disappointment, the liminal zone where dreams either materialize or dissolve. And perhaps that's why it affects people so intensely. because it reflects back not what you achieved, but what you desperately wanted and didn't get. The letters keep arriving. In 2024 alone, the Hollywood Heritage Museum received 43 new pieces of correspondence about the Hollywood sign. All but 6 were confession letters. People are still coming to Los Angeles with dreams. Those dreams are still failing at statistically inevitable rates. And the sign still stands on its hillside, watching it all, collecting stories that no one else wants to hear. Dr. James Ritter didn't believe in haunted landmarks, which is why he decided to study the Hollywood sign. In 2007, Ritter, a psychologist at UCLA specializing in environmental psychology and the effects of place on human emotion, received a research grant to study psychological responses to iconic locations. The Hollywood sign was his primary research site. Ritter's hypothesis was straightforward. The sign's reputation as a haunted or emotionally charged location was entirely explainable through psychological and cultural factors: expectation, suggestion, myth-making, and the human tendency to project meaning onto ambiguous stimuli. Ritter designed the careful study. Between 2008 and 2011, he and his research team interviewed 847 people who visited the Hollywood sign. The team used standardized psychological assessments to measure visitors' emotional states before and after their visit, their suggestibility levels, their prior knowledge of the sign's history, and their openness to supernatural beliefs. Ritter also collected physiological data: heart rate, skin conductance, a measure of stress or arousal, and cortisol levels, a stress hormone. His preliminary findings seemed to confirm his hypothesis. Visitors who knew about Peg Entelswood and the sign's association with suicide reported more negative emotional experiences during their visit, compared to visitors who were unaware of this history. Highly suggestible individuals, people who scored high on standardized suggestibility scales, were more likely to report feeling watched or sensing a presence. There was a clear correlation between expectation and experience. But then, Ritter's data revealed something unexpected. Approximately 12% of visitors reported negative emotional experiences despite having no prior knowledge of the sign's dark history and scoring low on suggestibility measures. These individuals, let's call them the anomalous responders, arrived at the sign expecting a pleasant tourist experience, and instead felt unexplained sadness, anxiety, or discomfort. Even more puzzling, these anomalous responders showed measurable physiological changes: elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, and heightened skin conductance that persisted for 20 to 30 minutes after arriving at the sign. These weren't imagined or subjectively reported symptoms. They were objective biological responses to something in the environment. Ritter spent the next 2 years trying to identify what environmental factors might explain these responses. He measured air quality. Could environmental pollutants or allergens be affecting some visitors? Electromagnetic fields. Could electrical installations near the sign be creating measurable EM interference? Infrasound. Could low-frequency sound waves, sometimes called fear frequencies, be present? And even the hillside's geology. Could certain mineral compositions affect some people's neurological functioning? His 2013 paper in the Journal of Environmental Psychology reported his findings. We identified no environmental factors that consistently correlated with anomalous psychological and physiological responses in our sample. Air quality, EM fields, and infrasound levels at the Hollywood sign site were all within normal parameters and did not differ significantly from control locations in Los Angeles that did not generate similar responses. The source of the observed physiological stress reactions in approximately 12% of visitors remains unexplained within standard environmental psychology frameworks. Ritter's conclusion was carefully worded but represented a significant shift from his original hypothesis. While the majority of negative experiences at the Hollywood sign can be attributed to expectation and suggestion based on cultural narratives, a subset of responses appears to be triggered by factors we have not yet identified. Further research is needed to determine whether these responses reflect currently unmeasured environmental variables or represent a category of psychological phenomenon not adequately captured by existing models. In less academic language, Ritter went looking for proof that the Hollywood sign's reputation was entirely myth and ended up with data he couldn't explain. Other researchers have had similar experiences. Dr. Eleanor Zhang, a geophysicist at Caltech, conducted a comprehensive geological survey of the Hollywood sign area in 2016, looking for unusual mineral compositions, fault lines, underground water sources, or other geological features that might explain the location's reputation. Her team used ground-penetrating radar, magnetic resonance imaging, and soil sampling to create a detailed geological map of the hillside. Zhang's findings were simultaneously boring and intriguing. The hillside's geology was unremarkable. Typical Southern California sedimentary rock formations, no unusual mineral concentrations, no fault lines running directly under the sign, no underground caverns or water sources. But her radar imaging revealed something unexpected, an anomaly approximately 120 feet below the sign's foundation, an area where radar waves behaved strangely, either reflecting in unusual patterns or being absorbed more than standard rock formations would explain. Zhang's team conducted 3 separate surveys using different equipment to verify the anomaly. It appeared consistently across all measurements. In her 2017 report, Zhang wrote, "We have identified a geological feature beneath the Hollywood sign that does not match standard sedimentary rock profiles. The feature is approximately 30 feet in diameter and shows radar absorption patterns consistent with either A, an area of unusually dense material, B, a void or cavity, or C, material with electrical properties different from surrounding rock. We cannot determine the nature of this feature without excavation, which is not feasible given the location." What is this feature? Zhang offers 3 possibilities. It could be a natural geological formation, perhaps a dense igneous intrusion or a collapsed ancient cave system. It could be a human artifact, perhaps something buried there either before or after the sign's construction. Or it could be a limitation of ground-penetrating radar technology, producing a false reading. But here's the intriguing detail. Zhang's geological map shows this anomaly is positioned almost directly beneath the letter L, one of the letters that Albert Koth specifically identified in his diary as a place where he felt presence most strongly, and one of the letters that has consistently required more maintenance than others. Is this correlation meaningful? Zhang is appropriately skeptical. Without excavation or more advanced imaging technology, we cannot determine if the geological anomaly has any relationship to reported experiences at the sign. The correlation could be entirely coincidental. Yet the coincidence is tantalizing. Multiple independent sources, a 1920s caretaker's diary, structural decay patterns, and 21st century geological surveys all point to the same location as somehow different from the surrounding area. The skeptical position remains strong and well-reasoned. Dr. Michael Davis, a prominent skeptic and author of Myth-Making in Modern America, argues that the Hollywood sign's reputation is a perfect example of how cultural narratives create self-fulfilling prophecies. Once a location becomes known as haunted or emotionally charged, every ambiguous experience gets interpreted through that lens. The person who feels sad at the Hollywood sign assumes something about the location caused their sadness, when in fact they may have been sad already, or sad for reasons having nothing to do with the sign. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine, and we're remarkably good at finding patterns even in random data. Davis is right that humans are susceptible to confirmation bias and pattern recognition errors, but his explanation struggles with data like Ritter's physiological measurements. Visitors who arrived with no expectation of negative experiences and no knowledge of the sign's history nonetheless showed measurable stress responses. Confirmation bias can't create elevated cortisol levels and increase heart rates, unless, as Davis would argue, the stress responses were caused by environmental factors we haven't identified. Perhaps something as simple as the physical exertion of hiking uphill, combined with anxiety about being in an unfamiliar environment. This back and forth between researchers and skeptics has continued for 2 decades with no resolution. Each study generates new data, some of which fits existing explanations and some of which doesn't. The anomalies are real, measurable, documented, replicated across different research teams, but what causes them remains genuinely unknown. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from Dr. Ritter himself in a 2019 interview. After 12 years of studying the Hollywood sign, I can tell you what I know and what I don't know. I know that the site's reputation is heavily influenced by cultural narratives, and that many reported experiences can be explained through expectation and suggestion. I also know that a subset of responses can't be explained that way. Something about that location affects some people in ways we don't fully understand. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but I've learned to be humble about the limits of our current scientific models. There are things happening at the Hollywood sign that we can measure, but not yet explain. Maybe future research will identify mundane causes we've missed. Or maybe we need new frameworks for understanding how places and people interact. The Hollywood sign remains scientifically unresolved, not definitively haunted, not definitively explained, but definitely strange. The Evidence Archive. 6 research figures. Number 1. 847 visitors interviewed by UCLA's Environmental Psychology Research Team between 2008 and 2011, with approximately 12%, 101 individuals, reporting unexplained negative emotional and physiological responses, despite having no prior knowledge of the sign's dark history and low suggestibility scores. Number 2. 120 feet below the sign's foundation is where Caltech geophysicists detected an anomalous feature in 2016 ground-penetrating radar surveys, a roughly 30-foot diameter area showing unusual radar absorption patterns that don't match surrounding geological formations and remain unexplained. Number 3. 20 to 30-minute duration of elevated cortisol levels and heightened stress responses measured in anomalous responders after arriving at the Hollywood sign, according to UCLA physiological monitoring data. Longer than typical stress responses to novel or mildly anxiety-producing situations. Number 4. 1,847 letters, emails, and notes are preserved in the Hollywood Heritage Museum's Correspondence Hollywood Sign Archive, spanning 1932 to 2025, with 73% classified as confession letters from people whose Hollywood dreams failed. Number 5. 63 documented instances between 1982 and 2025 where security cameras at the Hollywood sign captured apparent human figures that subsequent investigation found left no physical evidence of trespassing. No footprints, no fence disturbance, no triggered perimeter alarms. Number 6. 15% of archived letters, approximately 277 documents, describe experiences at the Hollywood sign of grief or sadness that felt external rather than internal. Emotional responses the writers described as not mine or coming from the location itself, spanning different eras, demographics, and belief systems. The story of the Hollywood sign begins centuries before 1923. In a history that was deliberately erased and is still rarely acknowledged. The land that became Mount Lee, the hillside that now supports those massive white letters, was originally Tongva territory, specifically part of the area the indigenous inhabitants called the Cahuenga Pass region. The Tongva people, also called Gabrieleños by Spanish colonizers, had lived in the Los Angeles basin for thousands of years before European contact, with settlements stretching from the coast to the inland valleys. What the Tongva called this specific hillside, we don't definitively know. The oral traditions were disrupted by colonization, mission systems, and the near genocide of California's indigenous populations in the 18th and 19th centuries. But fragments of information survived,
passed down through Tongva descendants and recorded by anthropologists in the early 20th century before that window of living memory closed. Dr. Cindy Alvitre, a Tongva elder and historian, has spent decades researching her people's relationship with the Hollywood Hills. In a 2018 oral history project, she shared what her grandmother had told her. There were places in those hills that our people didn't build permanent settlements, not because the land was bad. The land was beautiful, good for hunting, good for gathering, but because certain places had, she used a Tongva word I can't fully translate. The closest English would be restless spirits or old grief, places where something had happened long ago and the land remembered. Was the Hollywood sign area one of these places? Alvitre cautiously says it's possible, but can't confirm it definitively. What is documented is that when Spanish missionaries arrived in the late 1700s and began forcing Tongva people into the mission system, they noted in their records that indigenous guides showed reluctance to travel through certain parts of the Hollywood Hills, particularly at night. A 1797 diary entry from Father Fermín Lasuen, preserved in the Santa Barbara Mission Archive, includes this passage. Our native guides showed uneasiness when we proposed to make camp near the pass through the western hills. They insisted we continue to lower ground, though darkness was falling and the route ahead was unclear. When pressed for explanation, they spoke of voices in the hills and old sorrow. I attribute this to heathen superstition, though their discomfort was genuine and affected even the most cooperative among them. Were these voices and old sorrow connected to the specific hillside that would later hold the Hollywood sign? We can't know with certainty, but the geographical description, Western Hills near the Cahuenga Pass, matches the location. What happened on that hillside before Spanish colonization? Archaeological surveys of the Hollywood Hills have identified numerous Tongva sites, grinding stones, shell middens, rock art, but no systematic excavation has occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Hollywood sign. The area was developed for real estate in the 1920s without any archaeological assessment, which was standard practice in an era when indigenous history was actively dismissed as unimportant. Could there be Tongva artifacts, burial sites, or other culturally significant remains beneath the Hollywood sign? It's entirely possible. Southern California real estate development has repeatedly built over indigenous sites, often discovering them only when construction accidentally unearths something that can't be ignored. But more often, sites are destroyed without anyone noticing or caring. Dr. Alvitre argues that the Hollywood sign's history of tragedy and unease might be connected to this disregard. When you build on sacred ground or on ground that carries history and pain without acknowledgement or respect, that creates a spiritual debt. I'm not saying the land is cursed in the Hollywood movie sense, but there's an imbalance when you erase one story and try to write another on top of it without honoring what came before. This perspective, that the Hollywood sign's strange history stems from building on indigenous land without acknowledgement, is not provable in scientific terms. But it's worth considering that the Tongva understanding of place isn't about individual locations being inherently good or bad, but about relationships, how humans interact with land, what acknowledgement and respect are shown, what histories are honored or erased. The Hollywood sign was built as an advertisement for land speculation, the ultimate expression of viewing land purely as commodity, rather than as a place with history and meaning. It was constructed on hillsides that indigenous people had complex relationships with for thousands of years, without any acknowledgement of that history. The sign represented, and still represents, the complete erasure of indigenous presence in favor of a manufactured American dream narrative. Is it any wonder that such a site would feel, to many people, like it carries old grief? In 2015, a proposal was made to add an acknowledgement plaque near the Hollywood sign, recognizing that it stands on traditional Tongva territory. The proposal was quietly shelved by the Los Angeles Recreation and Parks Department, with officials citing concerns about opening complicated historical questions and potential liability issues.
the sign remains unaccompanied by any acknowledgement of Indigenous history. Dr. Alvitre was not surprised. Los Angeles has always been more comfortable with invented mythology than with actual history. The Hollywood sign perfectly represents that, a fake name for a fake neighborhood selling fake dreams on stolen land. Of course people feel strange there. They're standing at the intersection of about a dozen different kinds of erasure and make-believe, and some part of them, even if they don't consciously recognize it, knows something is wrong. Whether you accept spiritual interpretations or not, the material facts are undeniable. The Hollywood sign occupies land that Indigenous people lived on for millennia, land that was taken through colonization and violence, land that was never returned or acknowledged. That history exists whether we talk about it or not, and that history includes Tongva perspectives suggesting certain hillsides carried old grief or restless spirits, descriptions that, centuries later, echo what Albert Koth, visitors, researchers, and countless others have described feeling at the Hollywood sign. This doesn't prove anything supernatural, but it suggests that what we call haunting might sometimes be a collision between erased histories and present-day experiences, between what we're told a place means and what we sense, consciously or not, about its actual past. The Tongva people are still here. They never left despite everything done to erase them. And the Hollywood Hills are still their ancestral territory, no matter what signs have been built there or what stories have been written over the top of their history. If the Hollywood sign feels wrong to some people, perhaps that wrongness is the appropriate response to a monument built on erasure.
The Hollywood sign's strangest chapter may be happening right now, in the age of social media and digital mythology. In 2007, when smartphones with cameras became ubiquitous, the Hollywood sign transformed from a physical landmark you visited into a digital image you captured and shared. By 2025, an estimated 3.2 million photos of the Hollywood sign are posted to social media platforms annually. The sign has become one of the most photographed structures on Earth, not because of its architectural significance or beauty, but because photographing it and sharing that photograph has become a ritual of verification. I was in Los Angeles. I saw the thing. I exist. But something strange has been happening in these millions of digital images. Anomalies that appear in photos but weren't visible to the photographers when they took the pictures. The phenomenon started being discussed on Reddit in 2011 when a user posted a photo taken at the Hollywood sign with what appeared to be a translucent human figure visible in the background, near the letter H. The photographer insisted no one had been standing in that location when the photo was taken. Skeptics immediately offered explanations: lens flare, double exposure, software glitch, deliberate manipulation using photo editing software. But then more photos appeared, posted by different people from different countries using different camera equipment. By 2013, a Tumblr blog called Hollywood Sign Anomalies was collecting and cataloging these images. As of 2025, the blog has archived over 2,800 photos submitted by users claiming their pictures contained elements that weren't visible when photographing the sign. The anomalies fall into several categories. 1. Figures. Apparent human shapes visible in photos that photographers claim weren't present when shooting. These range from vague shadow-like forms to surprisingly detailed translucent figures, almost always appearing near the H or L letters. 2. Light anomalies. Unexplained light sources. Unusual glows around certain letters, or strange light patterns that don't correspond to the sun angle or any obvious environmental light source. 3. Distortions. Letters that appear blurred, warped, or somehow wrong in photos, even though the rest of the image is sharp and clear. One recurring pattern: the letter L appearing to lean or tilt at angles that don't match its actual physical structure. 4. Temporal anomalies. Photos that appear to show the sign in different states of repair than it actually was when photographed. For instance, photos taken in 2015 when the sign was in good condition sometimes show letters appearing deteriorated or damaged as they looked in the 1970s. Skeptical analysis of these photos is straightforward. Most are easily explained as lens flares, software artifacts, motion blur, atmospheric effects, or deliberate manipulation. The figures are almost always ambiguous shapes that pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see patterns and faces in random visual noise, interprets as human forms. The light anomalies are consistent with common camera artifacts. The distortions result from camera shake or autofocus errors. The temporal anomalies are either misremembered dates or manipulated images. This skeptical analysis is almost certainly correct for the vast majority of these photos, but almost certainly and vast majority leave room for the small percentage that are harder to dismiss. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a digital forensics expert who analyzed 200 of these photos in 2019, found that approximately 12% showed anomalies she couldn't fully explain through standard camera artifacts or manipulation. Her report noted, "While I cannot rule out sophisticated photo editing in all cases, some images show characteristics inconsistent with common manipulation techniques. The anomalies appear to be captured by the camera's sensor rather than added in post-processing, and they don't match patterns produced by known lens flares, sensor noise, or software glitches. I cannot determine what these anomalies represent, only that their origin is unclear." That 12% figure is intriguing because it matches the percentage of visitors in Dr. Ritter's psychological study who experienced unexplained responses at the sign. Is this meaningful correlation or meaningless coincidence? The even stranger development is what happens when these photos are shared on social media. Posts featuring anomalous Hollywood sign photos generate significantly more engagement, likes, shares, and comments. They go viral in ways that normal tourist photos don't. Some of the most shared images reach millions of people. And here's where it gets genuinely weird. Some people who view these anomalous photos report emotional responses similar to what visitors report experiencing at the physical sign: sadness, unease, the sense of being watched. They're having these responses to digital images viewed on screens thousands of miles from Los Angeles. A 2021 study by communications researchers at USC examined this phenomenon. They showed 500 participants 3 categories of Hollywood sign photos: normal tourist photos, photos with confirmed artificial ghost images added through manipulation, and photos from the anomalous category that couldn't be explained as manipulation or artifacts. Participants didn't know which category they were viewing. The result? Participants reported significantly higher levels of negative emotion when viewing the unexplained anomalous photos compared to both normal photos and photos with artificially added ghosts. The unexplained anomalies triggered stronger emotional responses than images where ghosts had been deliberately created. How is this possible? The research team hypothesized that unexplained anomalies might contain subtle visual information, lighting, composition, color patterns, that communicates unease on a subconscious level, even when viewers can't consciously identify what's wrong with the image. Or perhaps viewers pick up on something authentic in these photos that's absent from artificially manipulated images, even if they can't articulate what that authentic element is. The digital age has also created a new phenomenon: Hollywood sign pilgrimages, specifically motivated by online stories. People read about the sign's dark history on Reddit, watch YouTube videos about Hollywood sign hauntings, see the anomalous photos, and then travel to Los Angeles specifically to experience the sign firsthand. They arrive with expectations shaped entirely by digital narratives. Do these expectations create self-fulfilling prophecies? Undoubtedly, in many cases, but not in all cases. Some visitors arrive seeking paranormal experiences and are disappointed when nothing happens. Others arrive expecting nothing and leave unsettled by experiences they didn't anticipate.
The Hollywood sign has become a strange hybrid, a physical structure that most people experience primarily through digital mediation. An estimated 92% of people who encounter the Hollywood sign do so through photos, videos, or social media rather than in-person visits. The sign's cultural impact is now almost entirely digital. This raises a philosophical question. If a landmark is primarily experienced through digital representations, and if anomalies appear in those digital representations, are the anomalies real? What does real even mean in this context? The Hollywood sign exists simultaneously in physical space, 9 letters on a hillside, and digital space, billions of images, videos, and virtual representations. And increasingly, the digital version seems to have its own behaviors, the anomalous photos, the viral spread of certain images, the emotional responses to digital representations. It's as though the sign has developed a digital presence that operates according to its own rules. This is the Hollywood sign's newest transformation, from physical structure to physical digital hybrid to primarily digital phenomenon that most people never physically encounter but millions experience through screens. And the strange experiences associated with the physical sign seem to be migrating into its digital representations. We're watching in real time as a landmark becomes a viral phenomenon, as mythology spreads through social networks at unprecedented speed, and as the boundaries between physical and digital, between real and virtual, become increasingly meaningless. The Hollywood sign was always about image over substance, appearance over reality. Now it's become literally more image than substance, existing more fully in digital space than in physical space. And the strangeness follows it there. The Hollywood sign turns 102 years old in 2025, and we still don't know what it really is. This seems like an absurd statement. Of course we know what it is. 9 letters, each 45 feet tall, painted white, mounted on a hillside above Los Angeles. We have construction records, maintenance logs, thousands of photographs documenting every phase of its existence. We know exactly what it is. Except we don't, because a structure isn't just its physical components. It's also what it means, what it does to people, what happens around it. And by those measures, the Hollywood sign remains profoundly mysterious. Let's summarize what we actually know. We know that the sign was built in 1923 as a temporary real estate advertisement and has survived nearly 9 times its intended lifespan through a combination of luck, celebrity interventions, and engineering that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. We know that the sign's original caretaker documented 16 years of unexplained experiences, electrical failures with no mechanical cause, feelings of being watched, a sense of presence around certain letters, and at least one vivid episode of seeing figures on the hillside that he couldn't explain. We know that Peg Entwistle's 1932 suicide transformed the sign from a failing advertisement into a symbol of Hollywood's dark side, creating a mythology that has endured for 9 decades and inspired countless ghost sightings, most of which can be explained psychologically, but some of which resist easy explanation. We know that the sign has been associated with at least 18 suicides and numerous attempts, that it functions as a suicide contagion site for reasons that go beyond simple accessibility, and that some people who die there seem to have viewed the location as symbolically meaningful in ways that suggest the sign represents more than just Hollywood to them. We know that security cameras have captured anomalous footage dozens of times, apparent human figures that leave no physical evidence, and that while each individual instance could be explained as equipment malfunction or misidentification, the consistency across decades and different technologies remains puzzling. We know that scientific studies have documented measurable physiological stress responses in approximately 12% of visitors, despite those visitors having no prior knowledge of the sign's dark history and low suggestibility scores, and that researchers haven't identified environmental factors to explain these responses. We know that ground-penetrating radar detected a geological anomaly 120 feet below the sign that doesn't match surrounding rock formations, and that this anomaly is positioned beneath the letter L, one of the letters consistently associated with unusual experiences and accelerated structural decay. We know that the sign occupies Indigenous Tongva land, and that fragmentary historical evidence suggests the Tongva may have viewed certain Hollywood Hills locations as carrying old grief or restless spirits, though the specific hillside of the sign cannot be definitively confirmed as one of these places. We know that in the digital age, anomalous images of the sign circulate on social media, some of which resist explanation as manipulation or camera artifacts, and that these images trigger emotional responses in viewers similar to responses reported by physical visitors to the sign. We know all of this. What we don't know is what it means. The rationalist explanation is that the Hollywood sign is simply a structure that accumulated mythology through a combination of tragic coincidence, Entwistle suicide, media amplification, psychological suggestion, and the human tendency to find patterns in random events. Everything unusual about the sign, the experiences, the sightings, the anomalies, can be explained through individual mundane causes: equipment failure, hallucination, misperception, mental health crises, camera artifacts, geological coincidence. There is no central mystery, only a collection of separate mundane phenomena that seem connected because we want them to be. This explanation is reasonable, scientifically defensible, and probably correct, but it struggles with the consistency. Why the same types of experiences recur across different people, different eras, different circumstances? Why do independent witnesses describe the same feelings at the same locations? Why do structural and geological anomalies correlate with historical accounts? Why do scientific measurements show effects that researchers can't explain? The alternative explanation, that something genuinely anomalous is happening at the Hollywood sign, requires accepting possibilities that challenge materialist scientific frameworks. Perhaps locations can accumulate emotional or psychological imprints from traumatic events. Perhaps geological features create effects on human consciousness that we don't yet have instruments to measure. Perhaps the intersection of indigenous displacement, colonial erasure, architectural hubris, accumulated tragedy, and cultural myth-making creates something that operates according to rules we don't yet understand. This explanation is unfalsifiable, scientifically problematic, and quite possibly wrong, but it accounts for the data in ways that purely rationalist explanations struggle with. The truth might be neither explanation, or some combination of both. Maybe most Hollywood sign experiences are exactly what skeptics say: psychological suggestion and misinterpretation, while a small subset are genuinely anomalous and unexplained. Maybe the rationalist framework is correct, but incomplete, missing factors that future science will identify and incorporate. Or maybe the Hollywood sign is what it has always claimed to be: Hollywood's truest symbol, a structure where appearance and reality collapse into each other so completely that you can't separate them, where the mythology and the physics, the dreams and the tragedies, the image and the thing itself become the same. The sign stands on its hillside, white letters gleaming in the California sun, looking exactly like what tourists expect to see. 9 letters spelling a name that isn't really a place, representing an industry that manufactures illusions, marking a hillside that may or may not want those letters there. Millions of people will visit this year, photograph it, share those photos, and go home with their verification that they saw the famous thing. Most will have normal, pleasant tourist experiences, but some, a small, consistent percentage, will come away disturbed, haunted, changed by an encounter with something they can't quite name. The Hollywood sign turns 102 years old in 2025, and after a century of observation, documentation, research, and speculation, we are left with the same question that troubled Albert Koth in 1923. What is this place, really? The answer, like the letters themselves, is visible from a distance but dissolves into mystery the closer you get. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the Hollywood sign's greatest trick isn't that it represents Hollywood's dreams, but that it embodies Hollywood's fundamental truth. Nothing is what it appears to be, and the closer you look, the less you understand. The sign will stand through 2025, through 2028's planned renovation, perhaps through the end of this century if structural engineers and preservation funding hold out. It will continue generating experiences, stories, anomalies, and questions. Researchers will continue studying it. Skeptics will continue explaining it. Believers will continue mythologizing it. And somewhere beneath those white letters, on a hillside that Indigenous people may have avoided for reasons now lost to history, the question remains unanswered. Is this place haunted by what happened here or by what was erased before anything happened here at all?